I never believed in the things my grandfather whispered about during those final fevered nights in the hospital, his weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength as he spoke in a language I'd long forgotten. The words felt like stones dropping into dark water, ripples spreading through my consciousness in ways I couldn't understand then. He kept pointing toward the west, toward the land of his childhood, his eyes wide with something that looked less like fear and more like warning. When he died 3 weeks later, I told myself his ramblings were just the morphine talking, just the dying mind's last desperate grasp at meaning. But something inside me shifted that day, a compass, needles swinging toward a destination I didn't know I needed to find. So when Marcus called about putting together a team to document forgotten folklore on a remote reservation in the Southwest, I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. I told myself it was about honoring my grandfather's memory, about reconnecting with roots I'd spent my adult life pretending didn't exist. But the truth I'm only now beginning to understand, is that I was being called back to something that had been waiting for me all along, patient as stone, hungry as time itself. We crossed onto reservation land just before sunset, 5 of us crammed into Marcus's van with equipment we'd bought off. Paranormal investigation forums and confidence we'd borrowed from too many documentary series. Sarah had her thermal cameras, Devon his audio recorders sensitive enough to catch whispers from 100 yards away, and Jenna her laptop full of folklore she'd scraped from internet archives and conspiracy blogs. None of them knew my grandfather's. People came from somewhere near here, that the landscape rolling past my window felt like memories I'd inherited through blood rather than experience. The light fell differently here, golden and heavy, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward us from the red rock formations lining the dirt road. I remember pressing my palm against the window, glass, feeling it vibrate with the rumble of the engine and experiencing the strangest sensation that we were being watched from those distant ridges, not with curiosity, but with recognition. The way a predator watches familiar prey return to a watering hole, knowing the patterns by heart, anticipating every movement before it happens. Marcus was laughing about something, probably one of his theories about cryptids and interdimensional beings, but his voice seemed distant, muffled, as though the air itself had thickened the moment we passed a weathered sign I couldn't quite read. The feeling intensified as we drove deeper into the backcountry, following GPS coordinates Marcus had obtained from what he called reliable sources, urban explorers and folklore enthusiasts who'd never actually been here themselves, but had triangulated locations from tribal stories and old surveys. The road eventually disappeared into suggestion, twin tracks through scrubland that scraped the undercarriage of the van with sounds like fingernails on metal. No one else seemed to notice how the birdsong had stopped, how the usual desert sounds of insects and small creatures had fallen into an expectant silence. I wanted to say something, wanted to tell Marcus to turn around, but the words felt trapped behind my teeth, weighted down by shame at my own superstition. These were my friends. Rational people, scientists in their own enthusiastic amateur way, and I'd spent years building a life among people like them, people who explained things rather than feared them. But when I closed my eyes for just a moment, I could feel my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, his breath against my ear, speaking words I still couldn't translate. The sun touched the horizon ahead of us, bleeding red across the sky, and I watched our shadows stretch behind the van like dark roots we were dragging through sacred ground. We pulled up to the site Marcus had chosen just as dusk settled over the canyon, that brief, suspended moment when the world holds its breath between day and night. The location was marked by ancient rock formations that rose from the earth like broken teeth, petroglyphs carved into their surfaces, telling stories in a language none of us could properly read. Sarah immediately started unpacking equipment, her excitement palpable, while Devon walked the perimeter with his recorder held high, headphones clamped over his ears. but I stood frozen beside the van, my eyes drawn to the patterns worn into the red rock, symbols that seemed to shift in the fading light. Something about this place felt wrong, in a way I couldn't articulate, wrong the way a chord sounds when one note is slightly off, creating dissonance that sets your teeth on edge. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder, mistaking my paralysis for awe, telling me this was going to be the documentation that finally proved something existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of accepted reality. I nodded, forcing a smile, and began unloading my gear, even as every instinct I'd spent years suppressing screamed at me to get back in the van. Somewhere in the gathering darkness beyond our little circle of fading light, something moved between the rocks with the silence of smoke, and though I saw nothing when I snapped my head toward the movement, I knew with absolute certainty that we were no longer alone, that we had never been alone, not since the moment we crossed the boundary onto land that remembered everything and forgot nothing. We set up camp in the shadow of the largest rock formation as the last light bled from the sky, arranging our tents in a semicircle around the equipment station Marcus had constructed with religious precision. The site itself was clearly significant in ways none of us had bothered to properly research, relying instead on the abbreviated folklore summaries Jenna had compiled from sources that treated sacred traditions as entertainment fodder. I remember kneeling to hammer in a tent stake and feeling the earth beneath my hands pulse with something that wasn't quite vibration, something more like recognition, the way your skin knows it's being watched before your mind catches up. Sarah was already mounting motion sensor cameras on tripods, positioning them to capture the entire clearing and the dark spaces between the rock formations where shadows pooled like oil. Devon paced the perimeter with his thermal scanner, occasionally stopping to make notes about temperature variations he found interesting, his scientific enthusiasm oblivious to the way the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Marcus started a fire in the center of our camp, the flames catching quickly in the dry wood we'd brought, casting dancing light across the petroglyphs that now seemed less like ancient art and more like warnings. We lacked the wisdom to understand. The warnings had come that afternoon, before we'd even unloaded the van, delivered by two men who'd appeared on the dirt track behind us, with the silent inevitability of clouds gathering before a storm. They were older, their faces carved by sun and time into landscapes that matched the surrounding desert, and they'd spoken to us in careful English weighted with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. They told us this place was not meant for curiosity seekers, that boundaries existed for reasons deeper than superstition, that some stories were not told to outsiders because the telling itself could wake things that should remain sleeping. Marcus had thanked them with performative politeness, assuring them we were respectful researchers, simply documenting cultural heritage, treating their concern as the expected resistance anthropologists always encountered when dealing with insular communities. Sarah had even tried to get them to sign release forms to be interviewed, apparently unable to distinguish between cooperation and warning, between permission and prophecy. The men had exchanged a look that communicated something beyond words, a resignation that suggested they'd delivered similar warnings before to people who'd made similar choices. And then they'd simply turned and walked back down the track, disappearing into the landscape with the ease of water returning to earth. I'd wanted to call after them, wanted to ask them what my grandfather had been trying to tell me in those final nights, but shame and pride kept me silent. And I'd watched them go while something cold settled into my chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Now, as we sat around the fire eating provisions from coolers and making plans for the night's documentation, I found myself unable to shake the memory of those men's eyes, or the feeling that we were children playing with matches in a house made of paper. Marcus was explaining his theory about indigenous folklore, representing encounters with undocumented species, cryptids that had learned to avoid human contact, treating sacred stories as merely misunderstood natural history. Jenna countered with ideas about interdimensional beings and thin places where realities overlapped, her enthusiasm making everything sound like an adventure rather than a transgression. But as they talked, I became aware of the sounds emerging from the canyon beyond our circle of firelight, calls that started almost familiar before twisting into something that belonged to no animal I could name. They echoed off the rock formations in ways that made it impossible to determine their source, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing in complexity as full darkness settled over us like a blanket woven from absence itself. Devon grabbed his audio recorder and pointed it toward the darkness, his face lit with excitement rather than concern, capturing what he called incredible vocalization patterns, without once considering that some sounds are warnings rather than performances, that nature sometimes speaks in languages meant to repel rather than invite. The temperature dropped as night claimed the canyon completely, a cold that felt purposeful rather than environmental, and I watched my breath form clouds in air that had been warm just moments before. Sarah checked her thermal cameras and reported unusual heat signatures moving along the ridgeline above us, patterns that appeared and disappeared without the consistency of wildlife, and I could hear the uncertainty entering her voice even as she tried to frame it in scientific terminology. Marcus fed more wood to the fire, the flames leaping higher, and in that moment I saw something in the petroglyphs behind him, symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light, forming patterns that my conscious mind couldn't read but my blood understood, warnings left by people who'd survived encounters with something that still remembered them. The sounds from the canyon grew closer, circling our camp with deliberate patience, and I realized with sudden clarity that we had not chosen this location, that Marcus's research and GPS coordinates and reliable sources had all been just the mechanism by which something patient and ancient had called us here, had called me here, completing a pattern that had started generations ago when my grandfather had left this land, carrying knowledge he'd tried to pass on to a grandson too modern to listen. The second night brought with it a quality of darkness that seemed to possess weight and texture, pressing against our camp like something with intention, and we huddled around the equipment station, watching Marcus review the motion sensor footage with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He'd set the cameras to record continuously, their infrared lenses capturing the clearing and surrounding rocks in that ghostly green monochrome that makes everything look like evidence of something, even when it's evidence of nothing. And for the first hour, we saw only the expected movements of night creatures and wind-stirred vegetation. Then, at timestamp 2317, something appeared at the eastern edge of the E-frame, emerging from behind the larger rock formation with a movement that made everyone lean forward simultaneously, our collective breathing synchronized in a way that felt ritualistic. At first it appeared to be moving upright, a bipedal gait that suggested human proportions, but there was something fundamentally wrong about the locomotion, a fluidity that human joints couldn't achieve, knees bending in directions that defied anatomy. We watched in silence as it crossed perhaps 15 feet of open ground, and then, without breaking stride or showing any transition, it dropped forward onto what should have been hands, but moved like paws, continuing its approach toward our camp on all fours with a predatory grace that belonged entirely to something wild. The eyes caught the infrared illumination and reflected it back with an intensity that created two bright spots on the screen. But the reflection was wrong, too sustained and too bright, holding the light in a way that spoke of tapetum lucidum, but with an architecture that seemed designed for purposes beyond mere night vision. Marcus replayed the footage 3 times, each viewing revealing new details that deepened our collective unease rather than providing the excitement we'd anticipated. Devon pointed out how the figure's proportions seemed to shift between its bipedal and quadrupedal movements. The torso, elongating and the limbs adjusting their apparent length in ways that suggested either an anatomical impossibility or a manipulation of form that our cameras couldn't properly capture. Sarah froze the frame when the figure was closest to the camera, perhaps 30 yards from where we'd been sleeping, and we could see what appeared to be fabric, clinging to parts of its body, remnants of clothing that hung in tatters across shoulders and torso, like the memory of humanity being worn as disguise. Jenna's hand went to her mouth when she noticed the thing's trajectory, how it wasn't wandering or exploring, but moving with unmistakable purpose directly toward the cluster of tents where we'd been unconscious and vulnerable, and the realization transformed our research footage into documentation of how close we'd come to something we couldn't name. I felt my grandfather's presence in that moment, not metaphorically, but as an almost physical sensation, as though he were standing behind me, trying to make me understand something my modern education had trained me to dismiss. The figure in the footage moved with an intelligence that was obvious even through the limitations of infrared recording, pausing occasionally to tilt its head in a gesture that suggested listening or perhaps tasting the air, processing information through senses we didn't possess and couldn't comprehend. There was purpose in every movement, intention in the way it approached our camp, and watching it, I understood with sickening certainty that we were not researchers who had stumbled upon something unknown, but prey that had been selected, studied, and deemed worthy of closer investigation by something that had been perfecting predation since before my ancestors had painted warnings on these rocks. The atmosphere in our camp underwent a fundamental transformation after viewing that footage, excitement curdling into something that tasted like fear but felt more complex. A mixture of dread and fascination that kept us all awake long past any rational bedtime. Marcus tried to maintain scientific detachment, talking about lens artifacts and unusual wildlife behavior patterns, but his voice carried a tremor that betrayed how thoroughly the footage had unsettled him, how watching something move between human and animal form had shaken foundations he'd built his worldview upon. Devon downloaded the footage to multiple drives with the obsessive redundancy of someone who already suspected evidence might disappear, might be taken by forces that didn't want their existence documented, and I watched him work with the grim recognition that we'd become characters in exactly the kind of story my grandfather used to tell, the ones that always ended with warnings rather than triumphs. Sarah kept glancing toward the darkness beyond our firelight, her earlier confidence replaced by hypervigilance, and I knew she was thinking what we were all thinking, that if the creature had approached that close once, it would return, that we had been marked by our trespass and would not be permitted to simply leave without consequence. I found myself silently apologizing to my grandfather, to the elders who'd warned us, to the land itself, offering contrition to forces I'd spent my adult life claiming not to believe in, and feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates grinding toward new configurations. The footage had revealed more than just an unknown creature. It had exposed the profound inadequacy of my skepticism, the way my rejection of my heritage had been less about rational thought and more about fear of belonging to something larger and older than my individual existence, and that recognition felt like falling and awakening simultaneously. We took turns maintaining watch through the remaining hours of darkness, no longer trusting our cameras to provide sufficient warning of approach, needing human consciousness standing guard against something that had demonstrated its ability to move through our defenses undetected. When my watch came, I sat alone by the dying fire, with my grandfather's voice echoing through memory, fragments of stories about beings that wore skins that weren't their own, that walked between forms and crossed boundaries that separated human from animal, living from dead, sacred from profane. He'd tried to teach me the proper words, the protection prayers, the ways of acknowledging and appeasing things that existed in spaces where my education insisted nothing could exist, but I'd been too embarrassed, too eager to assimilate into a world that had no room for such old knowledge. Now, sitting in darkness that felt populated by watching intelligence, I would have given anything to remember even one of those prayers, to possess even a fragment of the wisdom I'd rejected in my hurry to become something my grandfather would never be. The fire collapsed into embers, casting barely enough light to define the boundary between our camp and the wild beyond. And I understood with absolute certainty that I was being given an opportunity my grandfather had hoped I'd never need, a chance to choose whether I would honor the legacy he'd tried to preserve or continue running from the heritage that had brought me, inevitably, to this sacred and dangerous ground, where choices had consequences that echoed across generations. The dreams began that same night, arriving not as the disjointed fragments of normal sleep, but as experiences so vivid they felt like memories being downloaded directly into my consciousness from a source that existed outside my own mind. I found myself running through the desert under moonlight that painted everything in shades of silver and shadow, my body moving with a grace and power I'd never possessed in waking life, legs covering impossible distances with each stride, while the air tasted of sage and ancient stone. And something else, something wild that had no name in English. The landscape rushed past me with crystalline clarity, every detail sharp and immediate, and I realized with dreamlike acceptance that I wasn't running from something, but toward understanding, following paths my grandfather had walked, trails that existed in dimensions beyond the merely physical. In the distance, I could hear whispers carried on wind that shouldn't exist in the stillness, words in Diné Bizarre that I'd never learned but somehow comprehended, warnings and teachings woven together into a tapestry of meaning that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper, something genetic and ancestral, that had been waiting for permission to awaken. I ran until the landscape shifted into the clearing where we'd made camp, and standing at the center was the figure from our footage, but now I could see it clearly, could perceive the tragedy and hunger and terrible purpose that animated its stolen form, and it turned to look at me with eyes that held recognition, as though we'd known each other across lifetimes, as though my arrival here had been inevitable since the moment my grandfather took his last breath. I woke, gasping, my sleeping bag soaked with sweat despite the desert chill, and found myself whispering words in a language I shouldn't speak, protection prayers or invocations that my mouth formed with muscle memory inherited from bloodlines stretching back centuries. The dreams continued each night with increasing intensity, each one revealing new layers of connection between myself and the presence that circled our camp. And I began to understand that what we'd captured on camera wasn't simply a predator, but something far more complex, a being that existed at the intersection of punishment and teaching, guardian and threat, manifestation of consequences for boundaries transgressed. In the visions, I saw fragments of its origin, glimpses of a person who had chosen or been forced to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed, who had gained power through violation of sacred prohibitions and been transformed into something that enforced those very boundaries, trapped in eternal service to laws they'd once broken. The tragedy of its existence pressed against my consciousness, the awareness that it had once possessed a name and family and human hopes before hunger and ambition had consumed everything that made it. Merely mortal, leaving behind only purpose and hunger wrapped in flesh that no longer knew which form was original. I understood, with the certainty that comes only in dreams and moments of absolute truth, that my grandfather had tried to warn me about more than just physical danger, that he'd seen in me the same hungers, the same eagerness to abandon heritage in pursuit of acceptance elsewhere, the same dangerous wandering between worlds that created beings like the one watching our camp from the darkness beyond our inadequate fires. During waking hours, I found myself noticing patterns I'd missed before, signs that suggested communication rather than mere stalking, arrangements of stones and displaced objects that formed symbols I almost recognized from childhood memories of my grandfather's teachings. Small personal items would disappear from camp, only to reappear hours later in configurations that felt deliberate. My notebook left open to pages where I'd sketched the petroglyphs we'd documented, a turquoise pendant my grandfather had given me placed carefully atop the very footage that had captured the creature's approach. Sarah thought we were dealing with a territorial animal. Marcus insisted on documenting everything as unexplained phenomena. But I knew with growing certainty that we were engaged in dialogue with something that possessed intelligence and intention, something that was specifically addressing me through a language of symbols and gestures that bypassed spoken words. At night, while the others slept, I would sit at the edge of camp and feel its presence in the darkness. Not threatening, but observing, waiting for something, and I began leaving my own offerings, small gestures of respect and acknowledgement, water poured onto thirsty ground, tobacco my grandfather had given me scattered to the four directions, quiet words apologizing for trespass and asking for understanding rather than demanding safe passage. The connection deepened through these exchanges until I could sense its presence without seeing or hearing it. Could feel the weight of its attention shifting between curiosity and judgment, and I understood that this encounter had never been about the research team's cameras or scientific documentation, but about whether I would recognize the test my grandfather had known would come, whether I would honor the heritage I'd tried to abandon or continue, running from truths that had been chasing me long before we'd driven onto reservation land. The creature wasn't hunting us. It was teaching me, forcing recognition of the dangerous space I'd been occupying between worlds, showing me what happened to those who tried to take from both cultures while honoring neither, and offering me one final chance to choose which path I would walk before the choice was made for me in ways I wouldn't survive. In my dreams, we ran together through landscapes where past and present collapsed into eternal moment, and it showed me my grandfather's journey, the sacrifices he'd made to maintain balance, the knowledge he'd tried to pass on that I'd been too proud or too frightened to receive, and I finally understood that love and fear were inseparable in traditions designed to keep people safe from dangers that civilization pretended no longer existed. The morning after the fourth dream, we gathered around Marcus's laptop in tense silence as he queued up the footage from the previous night, our breath visible in the cold dawn air that smelled of sage smoke and something else, something sharp and animal that made the hair on my arms stand at attention despite layers of thermal clothing. The timestamp read 2:43 a.m., and for several seconds the infrared showed only the familiar landscape of our camp, sleeping bags arranged around the dying fire, equipment cases stacked near the vehicles, everything static and peaceful in the ghostly green glow of night vision technology. Then Sarah gasped and pointed, and we all saw it simultaneously, a figure standing at the very edge of the frame where firelight dissolved into absolute darkness, tall and wrong in ways that made my eyes hurt. Trying to focus on its exact proportions, as though reality itself struggled to contain its physical presence. What made my stomach drop wasn't just the appearance of the creature, but the detail Marcus's expensive camera had captured with merciless clarity, the remnants of human clothing hanging in tatters from a form that shifted between anatomies as it moved, a flannel shirt faded by decades of sun exposure, jeans torn and stained, one hiking boot still clinging to what was sometimes a human foot and sometimes something with too many joints. Clothing that suggested this being had once walked into town, had once purchased items from stores, had once been someone's son or brother or father, before transformation had consumed everything recognizable. We watched in paralyzed horror as the figure moved closer with each passing second, its gait a nightmare of biomechanics that alternated between confident human stride and predatory crouch, head tilting at angles that would break a human neck, studying our camp with an intensity that transcended mere animal curiosity and entered the realm of calculation, assessment, judgment. The camera had captured the moment it paused beside Sarah's tent, close enough that we could see its hand, if that word applied to the thing reaching toward the fabric, fingers that were too long and possessed too many segments, tipped with nails, that looked more like claws, but retained the shape memory of human keratin. It didn't tear the tent or attempt entry, but instead traced something on the canvas, a symbol or gesture we couldn't interpret from the footage, marking or claiming or warning in a language written through action rather than words. Then it moved to my tent, and the difference in its behavior was impossible to miss. The way it lowered itself closer to the ground, the way its entire posture shifted from threat assessment to something else, something that looked disturbingly like recognition or even greeting, and it remained there for almost 3 full minutes, simply observing the fabric that separated us, so close that its breath, if it breathed, must have touched the nylon that had been the only barrier between us, while I dreamed of running through ancestral landscapes. The most disturbing moment came as it finally moved away from my tent and turned to face the camera directly, as though it had known about the motion sensor all along and had performed for our benefit, wanting us to see, wanting me specifically to understand that this was not random stalking but deliberate communication. In that moment of direct confrontation with the lens, the infrared captured details that transform my horror into something more complex and infinitely more personal, the suggestion of features. Beneath the wrongness, the ghost of a human face struggling to surface through layers of transformation, and most devastating of all, the scraps of clothing it wore weren't random salvage but specific items. A flannel pattern I suddenly recognized from old photographs in my grandfather's house, a style of boot that hadn't been manufactured since the 1970s, details that suggested this creature's transformation had occurred in the same era when my grandfather had been a young man walking these same desert paths. The realization hit me like physical impact that this being and my grandfather had existed in the same time and place, that they might have known each other before one, had chosen or been forced to cross boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed, and that everything my grandfather had tried to teach me about respect and consequences had been born from direct knowledge of what happened when those lessons were ignored, when hunger for power or belonging or escape became more important than the prohibitions that kept humans safely human. When the footage ended, the silence in our camp had transformed from excited documentation to something approaching grief. Though my teammates didn't understand why their skeptical cameraman was crying while watching what should have been the discovery of a lifetime. They saw a monster, I saw a warning written in my grandfather's generation, a testament to choices and consequences that had been trying to reach me through bloodline and dream, and now through undeniable visual evidence that some boundaries existed for reasons that transcended superstition. The footprints appeared on the 3rd morning after we watched the footage, and their impossibility was so profound that even Marcus, who had spent 2 decades documenting unexplained phenomena with scientific detachment, stood at the perimeter of our camp with his coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, staring at the evidence with an expression that suggested his entire framework for understanding reality was collapsing in real time. The tracks circled our camp in a pattern that would have required hours to create, yet none of us had heard anything during the night, despite taking turns on watch, a complete loop that began at the eastern boundary where the creature had first appeared on camera and wound inward in a tightening spiral that brought it closer with each revolution until the final print stopped exactly 3 feet from where I had been sleeping. What made the tracks genuinely impossible wasn't their presence but their transformation, beginning as clear human footprints in the dust, bare feet with distinct toe impressions and the weight distribution of bipedal gait, then gradually shifting over the course of 20 yards into something else, the arch elongating, the toes spreading and developing claw indentations, the heel reshaping into a digitigrade structure that belonged to a large predator. All of this happening mid-stride without any break in the walking pattern, as though the creature's very anatomy was fluid and responsive to intention rather than fixed by biology. I knelt beside the transition point where human became other, placing my own hand next to a print that was caught between states, and felt a recognition in my bones that transcended intellectual understanding, a cellular memory of what it meant to be a creature that could slip between forms and purposes. Sarah documented everything with her camera while trying to maintain the professional composure that had served her through dozens of investigations. But I could hear the tremor in her voice as she narrated the evidence, describing how several of our personal items had gone missing during the night, with a selectivity that suggested deliberate choice rather than random scavenging or animal curiosity. Marcus's grandfather's compass, the one he carried on every expedition as a combination tool and talisman, had vanished from inside his locked equipment case without any sign of forced entry. The case still sealed and secured, but the compass simply gone as though it had never existed. Sarah's notebook, filled with months of research about Navajo folklore and the specific legends surrounding this region, had disappeared from inside her tent, despite the zipper remaining closed and the fabric showing no tears or disturbances. My own loss was the most personal and devastating, a photograph of my grandfather that I had carried in my wallet since his funeral, an image of him as a young man standing in what I now recognized as this exact canyon, his expression serious and knowing in ways I hadn't understood when I first inherited the picture. The creature had taken these items with surgical precision while leaving everything else untouched, choosing objects that carried emotional weight and ancestral connection, collecting pieces of our stories as though studying us through the artifacts we valued, learning who we were through what we kept close in the darkness. The sensation of being watched had evolved beyond paranoia into a constant physical pressure that made my skin crawl and my breath come shallow, an awareness of hostile intelligence that felt less like animal predation and more like being examined by something that possessed both the patience of geological time and the focused intensity of a scientist studying specimens under glass. We no longer worked alone, never wandered beyond the immediate sight of the group, conducted all our activities with the hypervigilance of prey animals who understand they occupy the bottom of a food chain they hadn't known existed. Yet despite our precautions, the presence grew stronger rather than weaker, as though our fear and recognition was exactly what it wanted, feeding something in its nature that required acknowledgement and terror in equal measure. I caught myself turning suddenly dozens of times each hour, certain I had seen movement in my peripheral vision, that distinctive wrongness of proportion that my brain registered before my conscious mind could process the details, only to find empty landscape that somehow felt less empty than it should. The others experienced similar sensations, that crawling certainty of eyes upon us, from the shadowed spaces between rocks, from the twisted juniper trees that dotted the canyon walls, from the darkness that gathered in the deeper arroyos even during full daylight. We had become the documented rather than the documenters, subjects in an observation that felt ancient and personal and filled with judgment about our presence in a place where we had never truly been welcome. That afternoon, as we sat in exhausted silence, trying to decide whether to pack up immediately or wait until dawn when travel would be safer, I found something that transformed my understanding of everything we had experienced, a discovery so personal and devastating that I initially couldn't speak, couldn't share what I held in my trembling hands. Tucked into the pocket of my jacket, placed there with impossible stealth while I had been wearing the garment, was my grandfather's missing photograph, returned but fundamentally altered in a way that made my heart hammer against my ribs with recognition and horror. Someone had written on the back in handwriting I recognized from birthday cards and letters, my grandfather's distinctive script, words that couldn't exist because he'd been dead for 3 months, and this photograph had been in my possession since the funeral. The message was brief and written in the Navajo language I had never learned, but somehow could suddenly read as clearly as English, as though the words carried their meaning directly into my understanding without requiring translation, bypassing language entirely to communicate through something deeper than vocabulary. Some hungers change us into what we fear most, and some families carry the memory of that change in their blood, waiting to see if each generation will honor the boundaries or test them, as I once tested them and paid the price. Nephew of my nephew, you stand where I stood and face what I faced. Choose wisely what kind of man walks away from this place. The implications crashed through me like physical blows. The suggestion that my grandfather's knowledge hadn't been academic or observational, but intimate and personal, that he had stood at the same crossroads I now occupied and somehow found his way back to humanity while others had not, and that this creature stalking our camp might wear the face and clothes of someone he had known, perhaps even loved before transformation had consumed. Everything recognizable, and left only hunger and wrongness in a shape that mocked human form. The elder arrived at dawn on the 4th morning without vehicle or apparent effort, simply present at the edge of our camp, as though he had materialized from the canyon itself. And the moment I saw him standing there in the soft light, with his weathered face and eyes that carried the weight of inherited knowledge, I recognized him from my grandfather's funeral, one of the men who had stood at the periphery speaking in hushed Navajo, while the rest of us mourned in English. He looked at me with an expression that combined compassion and disappointment, the gaze of someone who had hoped he wouldn't need to make this journey, but had known with resigned certainty that he would, that the pattern playing out before him was old and familiar and tragic in ways that transcended individual choice. He didn't introduce himself or explain his presence, didn't acknowledge Marcus or Sarah at all, his attention fixed entirely on me, as though the others were merely context for a conversation that concerned only my bloodline and the debts my family carried. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality of stone grinding against stone, ancient and immovable, and filled with a sadness that suggested he had delivered similar warnings before to other young men who stood at the same threshold of understanding and consequence. Your grandfather sent me to watch for your coming, made me promise before his passing that if you returned to this place, I would try to turn you back before the transformation began, before what lives in your blood recognized what walks in this canyon and reached across the distance to join with it. He hoped you would be wiser than he was when young, hoped you would honor the boundaries he learned to respect only after terrible cost. But blood calls to blood, and hunger recognizes its own face across generations. The words struck me with the force of accusation and revelation combined, confirming what I had begun to suspect since finding the photograph. With its impossible message that my grandfather's connection to this place hadn't been academic curiosity, but something far more intimate and dangerous, that he had walked closer to the edge of human identity than anyone should, and somehow found his way back, but never fully escaped what he had glimpsed in himself. The elder moved closer, his presence carrying the scent of sage and something older, cedar smoke and desert stone and time itself, and he explained what my grandfather had been too ashamed or protective to share during his lifetime. The truth that several men in our family line had been drawn to this canyon across generations, called by something in their nature that resonated with the creature that hunted here, a genetic memory of transformation and boundary crossing that made them vulnerable to the hunger that wore stolen skins and walked between human and animal states. My great-great-grandfather had disappeared in these canyons and returned 3 years later as something changed, something that knew how to wear human form, but no longer felt human in the ways that mattered, living the rest of his life at the edge of the reservation, avoiding touch and recognition until he finally walked back into the desert and never returned. My grandfather had come here as a young man, testing the family stories, seeking to prove he was stronger than the curse, or pattern, or whatever name you gave to the hunger, and he had survived the encounter but carried the mark of it for the rest of his life, fighting something inside himself that wanted to strip away civilization and restraint and surrender to the freedom of being neither fully human nor fully animal, but something fluid and powerful and terrible that existed between categories. The elder produced a leather pouch from inside his jacket and began preparing a cleansing ritual with materials that looked both ordinary and charged with significance, sage and cornmeal, and something that might have been ash or ground bone, speaking in Navajo while occasionally translating fragments for my benefit, explaining that we needed to leave immediately, but not before performing ceremonies that would sever the connection forming between me and the thing that watched us from the shadows. He said the creature had been drawn to our camp, not by accident, but by recognition, sensing in me the same potential for transformation that had claimed my ancestor, and nearly consumed my grandfather, that it sought to call forth what lived dormant in my blood and complete a change that had been threatening to manifest across generations of my family line. The ritual required my participation, required me to consciously reject what the creature offered, even as part of me resonated with its freedom from fixed form and social constraints, the seductive possibility of existing outside the boundaries that defined and limited human identity. As the elder worked, marking my forehead and hands with ash while chanting prayers that seemed to push back against the watching presence, I felt something inside myself that I had never consciously acknowledged before, a restlessness and hunger that had always made me feel slightly disconnected from normal life, as though I was performing humanity rather than naturally embodying it, and I understood with terrible clarity what my grandfather had fought against his entire adult life, and why he had hoped I might escape the family pattern by never learning its name. Marcus and Sarah watched the ceremony with expressions that suggested they finally understood. This had stopped being an investigation and become something personal and dangerous in ways their equipment couldn't measure or document. That we had stumbled into a story that predated our arrival and would continue long after we left or failed to leave, depending on choices I barely understood how to make. The elder worked with urgent efficiency while periodically glancing toward the canyon shadows as though expecting interruption, his movements suggesting this cleansing was as much spiritual protection as challenge to whatever authority claimed this territory, a declaration that I belonged to my human community and ancestors rather than to the hunger that sought to claim me through blood connection and inherited vulnerability. When he finished, he gripped my shoulder with surprising strength and told me we had until nightfall to be gone from this place, that the creature would make one final attempt to complete what it had started, to trigger the transformation that would either consume me or force me to consciously choose my humanity over the seductive freedom of becoming something powerful and unchained and irrevocably other. His final words carried the weight of absolute truth spoken by someone who had witnessed this pattern before and knew how rarely it ended, with the vulnerable person walking away unchanged. Tonight, it will show you what it truly is and offer you what your grandfather refused, the choice to surrender your fixed form and join it in the spaces between human and animal, between civilization and wild freedom. Your grandfather chose humanity and lived the rest of his life fighting what he had glimpsed in himself. Not everyone makes that choice, and fewer still survive the making of it. Pack your equipment and leave this place while you still recognize which choice your soul truly wants. We broke camp with frantic efficiency as the sun descended toward the canyon rim, our movements charged with the barely controlled panic of people who had finally accepted that academic curiosity and scientific skepticism offered no protection against what watched from the shadows with patient hunger and terrible recognition. Marcus and Sarah worked in uncharacteristic silence, dismantling equipment with shaking hands, while periodically scanning the deepening shadows as though expecting something to emerge before we could complete our escape, their earlier enthusiasm for documentation replaced by the primal understanding that some mysteries demanded retreat rather than investigation. I moved through the tasks mechanically while my mind churned with the elders' revelations about my grandfather and the pattern written in my family's blood, the knowledge that I carried something inside myself that resonated with the creature's nature and made me vulnerable to transformation in ways my companions could never fully comprehend. The elder had departed as quietly as he'd arrived, vanishing into the canyon with a final warning that we needed to cross the reservation boundary before full darkness, that the protection of sacred spaces and inherited prayers could shield us only if we demonstrated the wisdom to accept their limits and honor the boundaries our presence had already violated. As we loaded the last equipment into the vehicles, the sun touched the horizon and the quality of light shifted into that liminal space between day and night, when the world holds its breath and ancient things move more freely between the categories that usually contain them, and I felt something inside myself respond to that shift, with recognition and terrible yearning. The attack came as we were performing final checks on the vehicles, not with the sudden violence I had anticipated, but with a deliberate revelation that suggested the creature wanted us to see and understand what we had invited into our lives through ignorance and trespass. It emerged from the canyon shadows at the exact moment the sun disappeared behind the western rim, a figure that initially resembled a man walking upright but moved with a fluidity that defied human anatomy. Joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible, while its gait combined human stride with predatory grace that belonged to something designed for hunting across open desert. The remaining light caught its eyes with that same unnatural reflection we'd captured on camera, not the simple eye shine of nocturnal animals, but something that seemed to glow from within with its own cold intelligence. The gaze of something that understood human fear and vulnerability with the intimacy of a predator that had once worn human form itself. As it approached the edge of our camp with terrifying purpose, I could see the details that had been obscured in the camera footage, the way its proportions shifted subtly between human and animal dimensions, the remnants of clothing that hung from its frame like shed skin, the suggestion of a face that seemed to flicker between recognizable human features and something elongated and predatory that belonged to no single species but drew from many. Sarah's scream shattered the frozen moment and triggered chaos as Marcus grabbed equipment cases while shouting for us to get in the vehicles, his voice cracking with the kind of fear that comes from watching your understanding of reality collapse in real time and finding nothing underneath to stand on except the animal certainty that you need to run or die. But I couldn't move, rooted in place by something deeper than fear. A recognition that flowed through my blood and resonated in parts of myself I had never consciously acknowledged, as though the creature's presence called to something dormant inside me that wanted desperately to answer and surrender to the transformation it represented. The thing stopped at the boundary of our camp as though held by invisible barriers, and in that moment I saw its face clearly in the dying light, features that shifted and reformed like water, finding new channels, sometimes almost human enough to suggest who it might have been before the change, sometimes predatory and ancient beyond individual identity, and, for one horrible instant, the features stabilized into a configuration that resembled photographs I'd seen of my great-great-grandfather before his disappearance, the same bone structure and distant eyes that suggested he was looking at horizons others couldn't perceive. The creature opened its mouth and sound emerged that shouldn't have been possible. A voice that combined human speech with animal harmonics, forming words in the Navajo I'd been hearing in my dreams. and though I didn't consciously understand the language my blood understood perfectly well, hearing the offer my grandfather had refused, and the invitation to join something ancient and powerful that existed outside the constraints of fixed identity and social belonging. Marcus was pulling at my arm, screaming that we needed to leave now. Sarah had already thrown herself into the vehicle, sobbing, and the cameras we'd left running continued their documentation of the moment when I stood at the exact threshold my grandfather had described, facing the choice between the human world, with all its limitations and grief, and the seductive freedom of becoming something that wore identity like changing clothes, and answered to no authority except its own hunger and the ancient patterns written in transformed blood. The creature took one step forward, and the gesture shattered whatever held me frozen, triggering a response that bypassed conscious thought and came from the part of myself that my grandfather had spent his life trying to protect me from, the inherited memory that knew exactly what the thing before me offered and what acceptance would cost in terms of everything that made me human, in the ways that mattered beyond simple biology. I felt something inside myself surge toward the surface, a hunger and recognition that wanted to strip away the constraints of fixed form and singular identity, to embrace the fluid freedom of existing between states and hunting under moonlight with senses that perceived the world in dimensions civilization had forgotten, and in that moment I understood with devastating clarity what my grandfather had fought against his entire adult life, and why his final words had been warnings I was too grief-stricken and ignorant to properly hear. The realization hit like cold water, shocking me back into my body and its limitations. If I stayed even another moment, I wouldn't be strong enough to choose humanity over the transformation pulling at my blood, wouldn't possess my grandfather's hard-won wisdom about what was worth preserving, even when something powerful and ancient offered to remake you into something that felt no grief or limitation or the exhausting weight of being singular and mortal and bound by rules you never agreed to follow. I broke and ran for the vehicle where Marcus had already started the engine, throwing myself into the passenger seat while screaming at him to drive, and as we lurched forward with Sarah sobbing in the back seat, I looked through the rear window and saw the creature standing perfectly still in the growing darkness, watching our retreat with eyes that glowed with patient certainty, as though it knew this wasn't an ending, but merely an interruption in a pattern that would find its completion eventually, because what lived in my blood would never stop calling to what walked in that canyon, wearing stolen forms and ancient hunger like a second skin. We drove through the night in traumatized silence, broken only by Sarah's occasional sobs and the sound of tires on deteriorating reservation roads, racing toward the boundary markers the elder had described, while I wrestled with revelations that rewrote my entire understanding of my grandfather's life and the inheritance he'd tried to protect me from through distance and deliberate silence. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity now. His insistence that I grow up away from the reservation, his refusal to teach me the language or traditional ways despite my childhood requests, the haunted look that would sometimes cross his face when relatives spoke about the old stories as though they were simply folklore rather than survival. Information encoded in narrative form. He hadn't been abandoning his heritage, as some family members suggested, hadn't been ashamed of his roots or trying to assimilate into white society for comfort or advancement. He'd been building walls between me and something that ran in our bloodline, using cultural distance as protective barrier against an inheritance that wasn't simply genetic but spiritual, something that could be awakened by proximity to sacred places and the call of things that walked between human and animal states with ancient hunger. The journal entries I'd found after his death and dismissed as fever dreams from his final illness now revealed themselves as desperate documentation of his own struggle, the lifelong battle to remain human, when something inside him responded to moonlight and open spaces with yearning for transformation that never completely faded, no matter how many decades he spent in cities surrounded by concrete and crowds. My presence on this reservation, drawn by grief and the anthropologist's arrogant belief that I could study my own heritage as though it were simply academic material, rather than living reality with teeth and consequences, had been the exact scenario he'd spent his life trying to prevent. The moment when ignorance met inheritance in a place where ancient things still remembered the old contracts and waited patiently for bloodlines to return to ground they'd never truly left. Marcus finally spoke as we crossed what felt like an invisible threshold, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing against my skull since sunset suddenly lifted, asking in a voice scraped raw whether I'd understood what that thing had been saying in the language none of us should have comprehended, but that had somehow communicated meaning directly into our nervous systems through channels that bypassed conscious translation. I couldn't answer immediately, because I was still processing what I'd heard and felt in that moment of recognition. The offer encoded not just in words, but in the resonance that had called to something pre-linguistic inside me, something that understood belonging and power and freedom from the constraints of singular fixed identity in ways my conscious mind found both seductive and terrifying. The creature had been offering kinship, I finally managed to explain, recognition of shared blood and the invitation to embrace what my grandfather had refused, to join something that existed outside the categories civilization used to contain and control the world, to become fluid and multiple and free from the grief and limitation that came with being human in the ways that trapped you inside linear time and singular perspective. But it hadn't told us the price, Sarah whispered from the back seat, her voice steadier now, that distance separated us from the immediate threat. It hadn't mentioned what you lose when you gain that kind of power and freedom, hadn't explained why your grandfather chose limitation over transformation, even though the hunger never left him. She was right, and in her observation I felt the crystallization of understanding that my grandfather's choice hadn't been rejection of his heritage, but the deepest possible honoring of it. He'd recognized that some aspects of traditional knowledge existed as warnings rather than invitations, that the stories about boundary crossers and shape-takers weren't celebratory myths, but cautionary documentation about what happened when humans reached for powers that required surrendering the very thing that made wisdom and choice and love possible in any meaningful sense. As we finally reached the reservation boundary and the headlights illuminated the highway that would carry us back toward the world of airports and universities and lives, that pretended such encounters existed only in folklore safely contained by academic analysis, I felt something inside myself settle and clarify, like sediment finding its proper layer after turbulent disruption. My grandfather hadn't been trying to sever me from my heritage, but to give me the foundation to approach it with wisdom rather than romantic ignorance, to understand that honoring tradition sometimes meant recognizing which doors should remain closed and which paths led not to empowerment, but to the dissolution of everything that made you capable of ethical choice and genuine connection. The camera equipment in our vehicle held documentation that we would never be able to share with academic audiences or post for public consumption, because some knowledge couldn't be transmitted through evidence and analysis, could only be understood through direct encounter that transformed the observer in ways that made objective reporting impossible and perhaps unethical. I thought about my grandfather's journal entries, describing his own encounter decades ago and his daily choice to remain human despite the hunger that never fully subsided, the discipline required to honor boundaries even when ancient things called from the other side with promises of transformation and belonging that answered to loneliness and grief with seductive solutions that required surrendering the very capacity to love and grieve in ways that connected you to others through vulnerability, rather than predatory understanding. His legacy wasn't cultural loss, but cultural wisdom. The understanding that some traditions survived precisely because each generation chose continuation over transformation, chose the limitations of humanity over the terrible freedoms that erased the self, even as they promised transcendence and power. We drove through the rest of the night in silence that felt different from the traumatized quiet of our initial escape, a contemplative stillness where each of us processed what we'd witnessed and what it meant for our understanding of reality, and the thin barriers between documented knowledge and the older truths that preceded scientific method and categorical thinking. As dawn broke over landscape that looked ordinary in morning light, innocent of the presences that moved through it after dark, I made the decision that I would not be returning to finish the research project that had brought us here, would not be transforming this encounter into dissertation material or academic publication that treated living reality as analyzable data. Instead, I would seek out the remaining elders who still held the traditional knowledge my grandfather had honored through strategic silence, would learn the language and ceremonies not to document them for outside audiences, but to understand the protective wisdom they contained and the boundaries they maintained against the ancient hungers that waited patiently for each generation to forget why those boundaries existed in the first place. My grandfather's death hadn't been the severing of connection to heritage that I'd mourned in my grief-stricken ignorance, but the passing of responsibility, the moment when protection became my burden to carry, and his warnings transformed from cryptic final words into crucial survival information I was finally humble enough to receive. The creature in the canyon hadn't been simply an external threat, but a mirror showing me what lived in potential inside my own blood, the choice point that each generation of my family faced between continuation and transformation, between honoring human limits and reaching for powers that dissolve the self into something ancient and multiple and free from everything that made wisdom or love or sacrifice meaningful in ways that connected rather than consumed. 3 weeks after we left the reservation, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by equipment we'd agreed never to use for its intended academic purpose, forcing myself to review footage that the others had already decided to delete from their personal archives, as though erasing evidence could somehow undo the transformation that encounter had worked on all of us. The camera we'd left running during our chaotic evacuation had captured 17 minutes of material that defied rational explanation, and I'd watched it dozens of times, searching for the moment where documentary reality crossed into something else, the precise frame where measurable phenomenon became encounter. With intelligence that operated according to rules my education had never acknowledged. But it was in the final seconds, during a moment I'd somehow missed in all my previous viewings, that I saw what made my hands go cold and my breath catch in recognition that felt like falling through ice into dark water. The creature had moved closer to a camera than I'd realized during our panic, close enough that for 3 frames its face passed through the LED light we'd mounted on the tripod. And in that brief illumination, what stared back from the screen wasn't simply animal or simply human, but something in between that wore features I recognized from mirrors and family photographs. The resemblance wasn't exact enough to be documentary proof of anything that would satisfy scientific scrutiny, but it was unmistakable enough to confirm what I'd felt during that moment of recognition in the canyon. The genetic echo that suggested this thing hunting us had once been someone who shared my bloodline, someone who'd made the choice my grandfather had refused and transformed into something that retained fragments of human appearance like echoes of a song played backward until melody became dissonant warning. I paused the footage on that frame and stared at the distorted reflection of inherited features, wondering which generation of my family had produced this creature and whether they'd understood what they were surrendering when they accepted the offer my grandfather had spent his life declining. The traditional stories spoke of transformation as permanent, a one-way crossing that erased return even if regret eventually emerged through whatever remained of human consciousness trapped inside animal hunger. And I found myself grieving for an ancestor I'd never known, whose choice had created a presence that now circled my family's bloodline through generations like a shark, waiting for each new member to approach sacred boundaries with insufficient respect or understanding. My grandfather had known about this specific creature, I realized, had perhaps even encountered it during his own youth, and recognized in its distorted features the fate of a brother or cousin or uncle who disappeared into the desert decades earlier and returned as something that wore human form, like uncomfortable clothing that no longer fit properly. That knowledge had informed every decision he'd made about my upbringing, every choice to create distance between me and the reservation, not from shame, but from protective love. The understanding that some family legacies were curses that could only be broken through deliberate severance, even when that severance looked like cultural abandonment to relatives who didn't carry the specific burden of this particular bloodline's hunger. But now I was connected in ways that couldn't be undone by distance or ignorance, marked by direct encounter and the recognition that had passed between us in that moment when the creature had looked at me and seen potential rather than simply prey. The question that haunted me in the weeks following our return wasn't whether the creature had followed us beyond the reservation boundaries, but whether it needed to, whether the real crossing had happened inside me during that moment of recognition when something sleeping in my genetic inheritance had opened its eyes and begun paying attention. I found myself waking from dreams where I ran through darkness on legs that shifted between 2 and 4, dreams that felt less like imagination and more like memory transmitted through blood. And in those disoriented moments, between sleeping and waking, I felt the hunger my grandfather had described in his journal entries, the yearning for transformation that answered to grief and loneliness with promises of escape from the unbearable weight of singular human consciousness. I began the language lessons and ceremony studies I'd promised myself, seeking out elders who taught with the understanding that this knowledge wasn't academic, but survival training for those who carried bloodlines that attracted attention from things that waited in the spaces between human and animal. And through their patient instruction, I learned the daily practices that created boundaries within as well as without. My grandfather's discipline hadn't been about suppression, but about conscious choice, repeated every morning. The ritual maintenance of human identity against pull toward dissolution that never disappeared, but could be honored and declined simultaneously through practices that acknowledged the hunger without feeding it. On the night I finally deleted the footage, erasing the last documentary evidence of our encounter from existence and accepting that some truths couldn't be transmitted through recorded proof, but only through direct teaching within communities that held the context for understanding, I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than at any moment since his death. He hadn't abandoned me to face this inheritance alone, but had prepared me through every choice that had looked like distance, had given me the foundation to choose continuation over transformation when the moment of testing arrived, and in that gift I finally understood what heritage truly meant beyond romantic notions of cultural connection. It meant receiving the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd faced the same choices and the same hungers, who'd learned through trial and suffering which boundaries protected rather than restricted, and who'd chosen daily discipline over seductive freedom because they understood that some doors once opened could never be closed again. The thing in the desert still waited, still circled my family's bloodline through dark spaces, where its patience was measured in decades rather than days, but I carried now the protective knowledge that transformed it from inevitable fate into choice point that each generation could face, with eyes open and tools inherited from ancestors who'd loved us enough to build walls that looked like distance until you understood they were actually bridges, spanning the dangerous ground between who we were and what we might become if we forgot why boundaries exist in the first place. What would you sacrifice to escape your grief, and would you recognize the cost until it was too late? Subscribe for more encounters that blur the line between folklore and the truths our ancestors tried desperately to preserve.